Hi, we're very pleased to be here with you at this important conference. Let me just briefly explain what our panel will be about. Um, we've invited panelists to come to share their participation in a book that will be published hopefully by the end of this year, and it's titled Censorship, Digital Media and the Global Crackdown on Freedom of Expression. And the three of us, our colleagues from Project Censored and elsewhere, we've worked on censorship issues, international media, war in media, fake news, and various topics like that. And we began to notice together that there were increasing calls for censorship several years ago when we started to conceive of the book. And then we began to notice that this censorship was around the world. There were increasing cyber laws by authoritarian governments trying to block what they called and what was identified often as fake news, misinformation, or hate speech. So we collected a group of our colleagues and began to really assemble and put together a book that we could make sense of the crackdown on freedom of expression online, but where it comes from, what the history of it really is. I've worked on war and media for a long time, and from my historical perspective, so much of fake news and misinformation is part of war propaganda and censorship. So governments and societies and countries at war, the crackdown on freedom of expression under national security grounds is very much a part of that. Throughout the history of American society, we have had blacklists and censorships and things like that. But recently we began to notice that, of course, what everybody in the world probably notices, that under the Trump administration, in fact, to get elected, that he had weaponized social media. And that was part of his campaign strategies. And then as this developed, many politicians in the country began to call for big tech to be monitored for hate speech, for content moderation. And we in censorship, and have studied censorship for so long, realize that that's just not a good idea. And in fact, now, as we see what's happening in Gaza, with the terrible attacks that are clearly under the Geneva Convention, genocide against civilian populations, it's now being done in the dark. So those kinds of actual war crimes also are a media and a censorship issue. The incitement of that kind of thing by the use of media, and then the censoring of alternative voices, and now actually the censoring of the actual attacks. So under Trump, he very much attacked journalists themselves, and the media were the enemy of the people. And on January 6th, there was a scaffold with a hangman's noose, and all of the journalists' equipment were thrown in a pile. We also noticed that part of the censorship is the jailing and taking out of journalists. In many countries, we know that it's always been dangerous for journalists in war zones, but we found that in countries like Mexico, it was equally as dangerous as if they were in a war zone. So all of these escalating things, authoritarian laws, we call it lawfare now, against online speech, where people go in and they're arrested when they can get traced back for criticizing the government, things like that. The deplatforming of lots of alternative voices across actually what is now a global media spectrum. So I wrote a couple of articles. I traced, because I've done war and media for many years, I traced war and media back to the ways in which censorship began to move from psychological warfare really among and now it's called Cyber Command, and to go online. And so legacy media, we're not only talking about digital media here, we're talking very much about the papers of record and legacy media as well. And we've also been writing a lot about that at the moment, about how the US media is very strong with its pro-Israel bias and is deplatforming many Palestinian voices. So that's the context of this book. Steve Masick has written also about in other countries how academics in this country and other countries as well have been targeted. And we have everything from Palestinian voices, professors and students being challenged on campuses to close down those voices, critical race studies, how LGBT people are being suppressed. We also talk a lot about how there's censorship by proxy because of the way algorithms and other things are designed. So we will hear from the censorship by proxy chapter authors, Mickey Huff and Andy Lee Ross and Avram Anderson. So Steve will talk a little bit about his American academics and in academia and in Hungary and things like that. Nolan will talk about his work with understanding how fake news works online, and also about how media literacy is the solution. I'm very pleased to have Amy Forbes here talking about the Philippines, and I will let the panelists introduce themselves. You don't have to know the titles of your chapters, but just go ahead and tell us what you wrote about and where you are located, and that is how we'll do it. So I will now move to Mickey. Would you like to start out?
Sure, no problem. Thanks so much, Robin. And thanks, everybody, at this Critical Media Literacy Conference of the Americas, 4th annual. It's great to be back here, although virtually for us this time. Thanks to all of you for being here, and thanks to all the organizers for keeping this going. Robin, thank you for introducing us all. And we're honored to be part of this really important book that's coming out next year on Peter Lang. The chapter we did, I'm going to be very brief, which is rare, but I'm going to pass it over to Andy Lee Roth and Avram Anderson. Our chapter in the book is on moving beyond prior restraint, and it's about the concept of censorship by proxy that Andy's going to talk about in a moment. But at Project Censored, that's the organization I'm director of. I'm also a professor in California of social science, media, journalism. I'm chair of journalism at the Apple Valley College, but I also direct the nonprofit Project Censored. We do an annual book on underreported media stories. As an organization, we've been around since 1976. We have documentary films, a weekly radio program, etc., where we talk about the importance of critical media literacy education for meaningful civic engagement. And this issue of censorship, historically in places like the United States, looks at the way government interferes and the prohibition of government from interfering with information. And what we've long talked about at Project Censored is something that's different than prior restraint. It's a form of censorship that takes place among the private corporations that control for profit the media, journalism, the public square. And whether it's 6 companies that control 90% in the United States or 5 big tech companies referred to as FANG, we have a very concentrated control of our media system. And what we talk about in our article is that we really need to have an expanded definition of censorship to understand the challenges we face and to understand how and why marginalized voices continue to be suppressed. And these are the kinds of struggles that we tend to hear about least. Robin Anderson brought up what's happening now in Israel, Gaza. We just published a great piece by her. Andy Roth has another piece coming out. That's an area where there's been significant framing and corporate censorship. Unfortunately, there's also been government censorship. And even right now in the US, we're seeing calls by Democrats like Amy Klobuchar in Minnesota to censor even more voices. The GOP is no better. In fact, there may be worse. They're calling for deporting people on visas that protest against Israeli policy. So we really have our work cut out for us. And the chapter that we present really tries to shift our attention away from this obvious government blacking out of stories, which we know they do because of WikiLeaks and Julian Assange and this important work that expose, and whistleblowers that expose government censorship. But the far more pernicious, insidious, sort of nefarious form we see is on the daily among how censorship occurs by private companies and big tech platforms. So in a nutshell, that's what we're trying to call attention to. And in the chapter, you'll see Andy's going to do some definitions for us. And Avram talks about some important case studies that we know there are documented instances of censored voices. There's a pattern of who gets censored and who doesn't. And I think that this book that's coming out next year is going to be really important because this isn't just a problem in places in the US, it's a problem all over the world to varying degrees. And I think we need to really start tackling it in that way if we're to make headway in the name of free expression, the right to know, and academic freedom. So with that, I'll hand it over to Andy Lee Roth. Thank you.
Thanks, Mickey. Thanks, Robin. And thanks to all our hosts with the Critical Media Literacy Conference of the Americas. So the online restrictions we're talking about in our chapter on censorship by proxy include things like content moderation, advertising block lists, enforcement of so-called community standards that are implemented by big tech platforms like Twitter, TikTok, Facebook, and also exist in different forms on things like Google and YouTube. And as Mickey alluded to, censorship has typically been treated as a matter of governmental control, with emphasis in the US, especially on the First Amendment and a host of legal precedents that establish limits on what's known as prior restraint by government. But what we know in this era of digital communication and interconnection is that media corporations now stand alongside, if not above, governments, national governments, as kind of commanding gatekeepers of what counts as legitimate public discourse on important issues. As Timothy Garton Ash wrote in Free Speech, 10 Principles for a Connected World, Google may not be a country, but it is a superpower. And what's true of Google is true of all these platforms, what a colleague of ours, Dorothy Kidd, calls the horses of the apocalypse. Their capacity to either enable, or in the cases we're focusing on, to limit freedom of information expression is greater than that of most nation states. So that's kind of where we start. That's what led us to develop this notion of censorship by proxy and to try to present it in the chapter of the Global Crackdown book that we're so honored to be part of, try to make it an analytic tool. So we have a working definition of what counts as censorship by proxy that I'm going to run through these three elements quickly, give you one example, and then turn it over to Avram, who will talk about some of the very important and contemporary applications of this concept as we're trying to develop it. So the first three elements of censorship by proxy that define it and distinguish it. First, so these involve restrictions on freedom of information, and the first characteristic is these are undertaken by private corporations. So I mentioned earlier, organizations like Alphabet, which owns Google and YouTube, or Meta, which owns and runs Facebook and Instagram, Twitter/X, etc. Right? So it's not the government per se. Second element of censorship by proxy as we explore it, the restrictions on freedom of information and expression exceed the usual legal limits on governmental censorship. They're stronger than, more pervasive. And third and finally, and this is, I think, the thing that brings them together, censorship by proxy serves the interests of both the corporate entities engaged in this directly in the censorship and government or other third-party interests, right? And it's that combination that gives censorship by proxy its particular flavor. Now, I think we present that in the chapter as something that we hope other people will take up and explore and help us develop this. This is kind of the bare bones of the theoretical framework. let me give you a concrete illustration that shows how this looks, what this looks like in practice. In March of 2022, RT America was shut down. It shut down operations. RT America had, between 2010 and 2022, served as the US-based channel of the global multilingual RT, or Russia Today network, which was funded by the Russian government. As I say, RT America shut down in March of 2022. Chris Hedges, who had a show on RT America at the time, On Contact. Chris Hedges is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist. He observed at the time, this was long the plan of the US government. And I want to say he was right, but not in a simple way. It wasn't the US government that shut down RT America. RT America was deplatformed, literally. We use that term a lot, but in this case, their platforms were literally taken away by DirecTV, Roku, Sling TV, and Dish. But Hedges wasn't wrong. If those were the companies that actually deplatformed RT America, they were probably acting in the interests of the US government. We know, as a matter of record, that back in November of 2017, the US State Department pressured journalists and other people working with RT America, some of whom are themselves American citizens, to register as foreign agents under the Foreign Agent Registration Act. And numerous news watch organizations documented after that took place how that had a chilling effect on those journalists' ability to do their jobs. And earlier that year, before the registration, the Intelligence Community Assessment, which is a joint security assessment by multiple US intelligence agencies, had determined that Russia had played a role, that Russian state-run propaganda had played a role in swinging the 2016 election. So the US had an interest in, and that report, that assessment, specifically mentioned RT America's programming. So we know there was, in effect, motive. There were efforts indirectly to make it more difficult for RT America to operate. But it would have probably been costly for the US government to simply shut down RT America. So this is, for us, an exemplary case of censorship by proxy. It's not clear, and I wouldn't want to be heard as saying the US government told Roku and DirecTV and Sling TV and Dish to deplatform. I don't think they needed to. I think that what spurred those private companies to action was the marked rise in anti-Russian sentiment that took place after the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022. And that public outrage manifested in complaints to these platforms that hosted RT America that they shouldn't be hosting RT America. And so that combination, so there's part of what our chapter is about, is the combination of censorship by proxy and moral panics. And we don't have time today to talk in depth about moral panics, but that provides me a hinge for turning it over to Avram, who will talk some more about contemporary and ongoing examples of censorship by proxy. Thanks.
Thank you, Andy and Mickey. My name is Avram Anderson. I'm a collection management librarian at California State University. I've been studying censorship of LGBTQ information in print and online now for quite a few years. So yeah, now I'll talk about just the impact that censorship by proxy has on LGBTQ information online. But I kind of wanted to like contextualize this. There's been a concerted effort to generate a moral panic about transgender people and the LGBTQ community in general. The GOP and other actors have removed books from libraries, banned the mention of gender identity and sexual orientation in the classroom, and forbidden the use of pronouns in some cases. Over the years, too, there's been an onslaught of anti-transgender legislation that continues to worsen year over year. This year, there's been over 500 bills introduced. So with all of this happening, the legislation, the rampant political homophobia and transphobia, LGBTQ voices simultaneously are being silenced and censored through various means, which can have serious consequences. So the censorship of LGBTQ information on online platforms can take different forms through things like algorithmic suppression or censorship, shadow banning, geo-blocking, and just to targeting like LGBTQ content creators and users themselves. So all of these things hinder freedom of expression and really perpetuates discrimination. Social media platforms like Facebook and YouTube use content moderation, like Andy had mentioned, community standards, and content blocking tactics that disproportionately impact and target the LGBTQ content. So it kind of acts like a double standard where while they'll ban LGBTQ themed content or even demonetize LGBTQ YouTube creators, they might ignore or disregard and even promote homophobic or transphobic content. And also, like in the name of tackling hate speech, major platforms like Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, which is now X, I suppose, have imposed some pretty like heavy-handed policies over the years. They've blocked transgender folks from using their chosen names through the use of something called real name policies. They've really put the brakes on LGBTQ advertising in some instances, and even kicked LGBTQ content creators off of platforms, even if it's just temporarily. And it often happens really without much regard for the intent like behind the content. Also, the marginalizing and or erasure of queer content online is a case of censorship by proxy that reflects and reinforces moral panic orchestrated by the religious right and embraced by many Republican politicians, unfortunately. So in addition to these things happening on online platforms, there's also legislation being introduced in the US and other countries that would or could impact the visibility of LGBTQ information online. And an example of that is the Earn It Act, which was originally introduced in 2020 and has been introduced over and over. But it's all about government mandated content moderation. And it's really aimed at, well, they say, aimed at preventing online sexual exploitation of children, which is something that we can all stand behind. But I believe, the Earn It Act has other consequences that aren't explicitly stated in the text of the bill. And some of those issues could be the weakening of Section 230 of the Communication Decency Act, which has been a law, which is a law that's been really like a lifeline for free speech on the internet. And also, the Earn It Act could have far-reaching consequences like overzealous censorship and erosion of online privacy, which could especially impact marginalized communities. And then also just restricting end-to-end encryption on platforms, which is important for everyone, and just keeping our online data and communications private and secure. I've seen similar bills popping up in other countries too, like there's the Online Safety Act in Australia, and then the Online Safety Bill, which is in the UK. And I'm fairly certain that I saw recently online that it passed, and so now it's law. And issues being raised around those two bills are similar, which is like overreach and censorship. And it's all under the guise of protecting children, which is really driven by the moral panic that I was talking about earlier. And right here in the US, anti-LGBTQ legislation, online content restrictions, and the curriculum regulations that we're seeing in schools are really creating like this hostile environment for LGBTQ people. And the wave of censorship is like particularly concerning, especially considering our nation's commitment to freedom of expression. So I'm just going to wrap it up by saying that we're seeing censorship by proxy become more widespread in the United States. And with that in mind, I think that we need to make sure that diverse voices, including those from the LGBTQ community, aren't silenced or marginalized further in the digital age.
Thank you so much, the authors of that fantastic chapter on censorship by proxy and colleagues at Project Censored. That was really good. Thanks so much. And I know some of you may have to be leaving now. So we're going to go next to Steve Masick, who has been researching censorship in academia on American campuses and other places around the world for a long time, and is a First Amendment scholar and is also one of the co-editors with us. So he'll talk about his chapters now.
Thanks a lot, Robin, and thank you all for being here, and thank the Critical Media Literacy Conference of the Americas for hosting this. It was a real pleasure to edit this volume that included so many of my friends and colleagues as contributing authors. My chapter is on the right-wing attack on academic freedom in Hungary, Turkey, and the US as sort of a symptom or a snapshot of a broader trend, which is an assault that we're seeing around the world on academic freedom by authoritarian regimes of various kinds. And I'm just going to time myself so I don't go over here. And I think almost everybody here on the call is themselves an academic or has been an academic. So you all know how vitally important academic freedom is to the functioning of the university and the functioning of higher education, right? Academic freedom is the foundation of modern higher education. For scholars, it means the freedom to pursue their research wherever it leads, no matter whom that may offend, right? It includes the freedom to teach their subjects in their areas of expertise as they see fit without any kind of external interference by political or administrative bodies. And it includes the freedom to publicize the results, right, of their research without sort of oversight. For institutions, for universities and colleges, it means the freedom to operate, to set their own internal policies and to decide whom to hire, whom to fire, what subjects to offer, etc. And for students, right, academic freedoms means being able to choose what they want to study, right, and the freedom to speak openly and freely about matters of public concern, right? At least in the sort of public forum areas of college campuses. So it's vitally important, and those of us who are at colleges and universities in the United States sort of take it for granted, but it is not securely established anywhere in the world, including here in the US. And I just want to note that in the past 3 or 4 months, right, we have seen a number of egregious attacks on academic freedom. First, Russia, back in July, detained world-famous sociologist and Marxist theorist Boris Kagarlitsky on charges of justifying terrorism online because he was making posts that were critical of Putin's war in India, or in Ukraine. In India, an assistant professor of economics at Ashoka University was forced to resign for publishing a scholarly paper entitled "Democratic Backsliding in the World's Largest Democracy" that presented evidence of voter suppression favoring India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi political party, BJP. The BJP slammed the paper as half-baked. The university administration distanced itself from the author and his findings, instituted a special inquiry to examine the paper's merits. Ultimately, he resigned, and I believe is without a job at the moment. Meanwhile, here in the United States, countless pro-Palestinian, anti-Zionist faculty and students at universities across the country are being subject to discipline, being suspended, being fired, and being doxxed for criticizing Israel's relentless killing of civilians in Gaza, which was, of course, a response to the October 7th Hamas terror attacks. To just take one example, and in my chapter, I write extensively about Governor Ron DeSantis's many attacks, many assaults on academic freedom. In Florida, Governor Ron DeSantis has actually, in the past couple of days, ordered universities to disband student groups affiliated with Students for Justice in Palestine, saying the group is affiliated with Hamas and supporting a terrorist organization. It's completely outrageous. It will not withstand court scrutiny. He doesn't seem to care about that because, as I detail in my chapter, right, he has presided over the passage of a number of laws that have been consistently struck down by the courts as a violation of the First Amendment or a violation of academic freedom. Laws, for example, making it possible for students to videotape their professors in the classroom, instituting surveys to gauge the level of intellectual diversity among faculty at University of Florida colleges, banning whole entire subjects, right, like critical race theory, or what he calls critical race theory, which is basically synonymous with teaching the truth about the history of race relations in the United States. And of course, as Avram pointed out, right, in passing legislation that very clearly enables teachers and administrators to remove books that have LGBTQ themes or characters from school libraries. But a lot of people are concerned that that same legislation could allow them to purge the shelves of university libraries as well. So academic freedom is under attack around the world. One of the things I tried to do in the chapter was to point out that in various places, including places where things are particularly bad, like Turkey and Hungary, students and faculty have fought back in valiant ways. And I'll just mention one example. In Turkey, under the Erdogan government has closed something like 3,000 colleges and universities, and has placed the premier, the flagship university, Bosphorus University, I think Bogazi University is the Turkish pronunciation of the name. The flagship university, essentially the Harvard of Turkey, has placed it essentially under receivership, imposing on that university political appointees at a place that has always been self-governing. Well, what the students have done and the faculty have done is they've resigned en masse, and they have made the university ungovernable by holding vigils and protests. Now, hundreds of students and faculty have ended up behind bars for doing this. But their example, I think, should be an inspiration to all of us about how we go about pushing back against this right-wing authoritarian attack on higher education. And that's where I'll end. And I'm going to only be able to stick around another 5 minutes, and then I got to go. Thanks. You're muted.
So sorry. I have to cough, and I unmuted myself. Okay. I'm very pleased. Thank you so much, Steve. I'm pleased that we have Amy Forbes here, who has written a very good, stellar chapter on the Philippines and what happened under the Duterte regime. Thank you so much, Amy. And tell us your title and where you're located. Thanks.
Thank you, Robin. I'm an associate professor here at the James Cook University in Australia. And I'd like to start by acknowledging the Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first inhabitants of this country. Particularly the Chapukayir, Kanji, and Gumayudinji people here in Cairns, where my campus is located. Now, I wrote this chapter with a colleague from the Philippines, Professor Gary Mariano, and we focused on the Duterte administration because, as many of you would be aware, press censorship, press freedom was severely threatened, even more visibly than ever before. Of course, there was the censorship and horrible things happening during the Marcos administration back in the 70s and 80s. But it came to the fore once again when Duterte came into office, because he had instituted this war against drugs, which basically was a blank check for him to order the killing of anyone suspected, so-called, of being drug abusers, drug traffickers, anything related to drugs. And of course, together with that, a lot of other unexplained killings and deaths. And so the media who reported on this became his new target, including those that were seen as not supportive of him during his campaign towards the presidency. Of course, the Philippines, as we recalled in that chapter, has had a long history of so-called press freedom, but it hasn't really been the case. We have this semblance of having press freedom on paper, but in the background and more recently in the foreground, highlighting the fact that there is no press freedom, that there have been a lot of actions against journalists. And in fact, if you name the instances of censorship and related issues, we would have examples of all of them, including the killing of journalists. I mean, between 2000 and 2022, there have been at least 140 journalists who have been killed in the action that they do as their profession. A lot of journalists have been subjected to intimidation, either through false accusations of tax evasion, all sorts of seemingly innocuous charges unrelated to the profession, but really the intention is for them to be immobilized and silenced. The President Duterte even admitted that during his campaign, he had resorted to hiring trolls so that the journalists who worked in the cyber space would have, as we have had experience here, attacks either through direct denial of service or people going into the sites and giving all sorts of comments that were unrelated to what was being presented, such as criticizing how the journalists looked, their hair, their all sorts of things, just to make things really difficult for them. And as I said, the cyber attacks, the National Telecommunications Commission is suspected of denying service, as you said, deplatforming, all sorts of things. And then, of course, the most common, I suppose, but very, very frightening is this practice of red tagging. Journalists are tagged as communists or communist sympathizers, and they can be, again, hauled off to prison and to courts, etc. One of our interviewees for this chapter, Lady Anne Salem herself, was charged with illegal possession of firearms. She's the editor of Manila Today, an alternative press, and she had to spend 2 months in jail, even as her case was being reviewed or, in the background, but she was kept in jail. And then even when the case was still fresh, and obviously there were false charges against her, the courts exercised their right to continue to review the case. So the Supreme Court, while not arguing against the finding that there was no case against her, reserved the right to review. And so she told us, every day she would think, will they be reviewing the case again? And will I be hauled off to jail again? And so in a big sense, that is a form of, forced self-censorship. And so her own publishers would tell her, keep the background, try not to write anything of anything that's controversial, just do the office work as we go through this. And thankfully, and I'll keep this short, just recently in September, the case was finally dismissed. Now, of course, Duterte had stepped down from office in 2022, but things are not going any better in the country with the ascension of Bongbong Marcos, who is the son of the ex-dictator. He has not been open to, in fact, he has not mentioned press freedom in either his inaugural address nor in his first State of the Nation address. When families of victims of the so-called war on drugs went to the ICC to get their help, and the ICC said that they would send the fact finders to the Philippines. The government reacted by saying that this is an intrusion into the sovereignty of the country, and that was during Duterte's time. And Marcos Jr. has not been open to the ICC as well, invoking the same argument, saying that this is an intrusion to the sovereignty of the country. And so, in a nutshell, we are in the same situation as we have been before. Nothing much has changed, except that perhaps Marcos Jr. has been largely trying to be absent from the limelight by refusing to attend press conferences, for example. And so in a way that produces this semblance of things are better, but it's because he has not been, open to press conferences, to journalists and so on. But things are the same. The largest broadcasting company that was shut down during the Duterte administration remains shut down, except that they've now moved on to the digital platform, and they have as many, if not more, viewers as they had previously. So the next thing that we expect would be more on the cyber attacks, because the more that you move into the cyberspace, the more that they can't control you, theoretically, but they do, and they have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amy. That was very informative, and I guess we'll see how things happen in the future if things get resolved. Okay, now we will go to Nolan Higdon, our co-editor, and he can tell you about his work in the book. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you very much, Robin. And it's wonderful to be a part of this panel here and be back at this conference. Yeah, for folks who don't know me, I'm Nolan Higdon, lecturer here in the Bay Area, co-founder of this conference, and I work a lot with the Media Freedom Foundation, which is the nonprofit board of Project Censored, where Andy and Mickey work, and it's also the nonprofit umbrella of this conference. So it's cool to be on a panel with those folks. It was really a blessing to work on this project. It came together quite quickly, in the sense the amount of contributors. A lot of people around the globe had a lot to say about censorship, and so it was a wonderful opportunity to work with some folks who I've known previously and meet some new folks like Amy and Gary. It was phenomenal to meet both of you as well. And Allison Butler, who's a dear friend and colleague of ours, couldn't make the panel today, but I do want to say she has a pretty rocking chapter in there on patriarchy as a form of censorship, which I think is really awesome, and something that we all benefit from reading and learning more about. I contributed two chapters to the text, and I'll briefly go through them, but they pick up on a lot of things we've already talked about on the panel. One of the chapters was the fake news crusaders chapter, where I looked at how the moral panic over fake news had been turned into a weapon to justify censorship of other groups and individuals. And particularly, I focused on the United States largely within that chapter. And I went through giving examples of how politicians from both parties here in the United States, 330 million people, we have two parties, our elections are Coke versus Pepsi, but both parties, Republicans and Democrats, were utilizing the fake news epithet to justify censorship and continue to do so now. But at the same time, both parties, whether it be under Trump or subsequently under President Joe Biden, the government was very active in creating forms of censorship at the federal level, regardless of which political party was in power. This included creating a board with the Department of Homeland Security to try and stamp out false information, or even working with third parties. This is the censorship by proxy. So working with groups like NewsGuard, which create a browser extension aimed at marginalizing those with alternative views. The United States-led NATO was working with the Center for Media Literacy to create media literacy content for the classroom, which is a whole new way to get colonized. And in addition to those narratives, I also talked about the way in which the supposed free press in the United States was also working to marginalize and censor certain communities. And I focused that particularly on COVID narratives. A lot of the critiques around COVID reporting, and many of which turned out to be true, which I note in the chapter, were initially suppressed. And the press had a part in that. So I cover a lot of that in the text as well. And then, of course, a lot of it focuses also on how big tech, under the auspices of fighting fake news, continue to perpetuate more and more false information. And in that, I relied on some of the whistleblower statements, some of the revelations from the so-called Twitter files, some of the interviews with big tech leaders to demonstrate that really, even those in big tech, we're admitting that we can't do what we're promising we're going to do, but we're being pressured to do this. So they were promising to eradicate disinformation and hate speech and all these things, knowing very well they couldn't do it. Instead, they were taking directions from powerful governments, including the United States government, many of which are in power because they're funded by groups like Big Pharma. So there was a very narrow form of censorship in these online spaces. And so I covered that in the fake news Crusaders chapter. And I think it's really important, particularly for a media literacy conference, because the chapter illustrates the close relationship between censorship and disinformation. Censorship is an incredible tool to narrow the scope of information down to just that in which the censor wants. And so it's really critical that if we're going to talk about the veracity of information and the power dynamics inside information, that we talk about the role that censorship plays in that process. And then closely related, the second chapter that I wrote was titled The Delusion of Power. And this was in response to a bunch of research that came out and polls in 2021 and 2022 that showed that overwhelming majorities of social media users believed that social media platforms were empowering them to hold people accountable. And so that is to say that over half of social media users believe that when they sign on to Facebook or Twitter X or Instagram or wherever it may be, that they are empowered to hold people accountable. And in this chapter, I really dispel that myth. I illustrate that the platform owners and operators and whatever vested interests they have, they really are the ones who hold the power. And everybody else just has the delusion of power on the platform that they're actually holding people accountable. Sometimes, of course, what some vocal minorities want online, that is what they want in terms of people being held accountable. Sometimes that also intersects with the interests of the platform holder, and it may happen. But in most cases, it's the platform holder that's ultimately deciding who does and does not get censored. And so when we talk about the power dynamics of the digital age, and we talk about users wanting to empower themselves, I think we also, as media literacy scholars and as media literacy educators, really need to dispel this myth that there's some open power vacuum that users engage in when they sign on to these platforms. As I gently call it, I call it the delusion of power. So those were the two chapters that I contributed to the volume. And like I said, I think it was a great opportunity, the way this work came together. The global focus ended up being really powerful. Even I was very surprised at how much of how the censorship emerges, and it looks very much the same regardless of the country it's in. And I think that's one of the things that readers are really going to appreciate about the text. I also think a lot of the contributors, they each put their own spin on thinking about censorship. So I think there is some substantive and very important disagreement in the text that I think readers will really benefit from. I found that to be some of the most interesting. And I know Rob and Steve and I had great conversations about how to respectfully include where some of these authors disagree and things like that. So hope you guys really enjoy that text, and I appreciate getting the opportunity to speak with such an esteemed panel. And I'll turn things back over to Robin.
Thanks, Nolan. I think before I wrap anything up, I think we're just pressed for time, and we want to get people to participate in Q&A, and people are waiting around to do that. So let's just go straight to question and answers. I've got my Q&A window open. I'm not sure how. I don't see an app where people put their hands up. I don't really know if there's a moderator that's going to help us here or not.
I think
Anyone can unmute if I think they can unmute if they want to just talk, no?
Yeah.
It looks like they can, yeah.
Yeah, folks can unmute. You all have one question from YouTube. I don't know if that's helpful or if you want to wait for some other folks.
Let's get the
Sure.
Let's see if we get any questions.
Okay,
From
sure.
the people.
Yeah, we don't have inside YouTube though. We know how they can censor.
All right, great.
YouTube has censored us. We're just getting back at them.
And this conference.
They
Was it
censored
this
this
conference?
conference.
Yes.
Oh, I'm
We-
so sorry to hear. I was unaware. Please carry on.
I don't see any questions. Then let's go to the YouTube one.
How about a question from a student that's present instead?
Sure.
Would that be all right?
Yeah.
Okay. One of our students who's volunteering would like to know, what recommendations do you have when you're trying to start to begin a career in journalism? And how can you be careful when you're looking for positions, but you're aware that many of these companies are, what'd you say? Oh, funded by major corporations. How can you still pursue a career in journalism, but be mindful of these things?
Well, I mean, as someone that's chair of a department and works with a career education program where we actually place journalists in young student journalists in jobs before they graduate with degrees even, which is a good thing overall. We try to sort of keep our own biases in check and encourage people to try to get involved in journalism where they can and how they can. Those jobs are much coveted, these paying jobs or things that pay living wages in journalism. They're also very competitive. And so we just try to be honest with students that are going through our program about what to expect, especially since we at Project Censored focus so much on independent media and journalism, where there are careers, but they're fewer and they maybe pay less. But again, I think it's just important to encourage students to pursue their passions and interests however they see them. And our job as educators is to try to help them navigate that and make the choices that best serve, what they need to do in their lives at that time. I know that's not maybe a sexy answer or not a real quick kind of, go-to point of wisdom, but I know that's what we try to do. And I would just say to young folks that want to do journalism, really just try to find avenues to do it as much as you can, as many places or different platforms as you can.
I'll try to get an answer. In my department at Fordham University, we're in New York City, one of the biggest media markets on earth. And I would try to find internships with lots of different organizations in independent media. And so we tried to create an avenue that way. But I had students who took jobs with Fox News, which wasn't my preferred, a Rupert Murdoch organ. But there's a lot of local journalism that Fox News actually doesn't do that badly with. I think it's good experience. I think they may come up against some ethical and moral constraints on their writing, and it would really be up to them. I think we try to imbue within our students a sense of journalistic ethics, and that journalism is a very important part of democracy. And if they feel that they have to go against that, it's really, we hope we've given them an underlying foundation of an educational experience that will allow them to say, no, I'm not willing to do that. I'm going to go someplace else.
Yeah, and I'll just add on quickly to that I think it's an exciting time for that question. I think one of the benefits of like the digital age is it really has brought down these corporate media giants in terms of audience size, in terms of revenue, and we're seeing that decline. And I think that's why you see like New York Times so heavily pushing like the subscriber model or getting into other fields like education, because they're desperate to make up revenue. And I say that as, I think, a good thing. I think it makes an opportunity for a lot of new media and independent outlets to emerge, which we're also seeing happening. So as a young journalist, I would say that look at the media environment you're going into now. This is not the 1970s where we want to be Woodward and Bernstein. It's a much different media environment. And so I would take that as a reason to be excited about it. You know, an opportunity to work in different platforms at different times. I think some of the stuff people are doing while podcasting and also substacking and doing live streams and things like that. I think there's a lot of benefit there. I would be remiss though if I didn't say that in the death of these corporate news media, we're also seeing the emergence of the FANGs and these massive digital corporations that are taking over that space. So while we develop this new media space and speak truth to power and further the aims of democracy, we also must be cognizant of the fact that we're working in these corporate plantations. And so we need to think about that as well.
Anything else?
Thank you so much for that response. Our student Zhao says that really helps. That's all from this student just wanted to share their question, but please, if anyone else that is with us has an additional question for the panel, please feel free to type into chat or to unmute. Additionally, if y'all have any questions that you want to pose to each other, that's also completely okay, whatever is best.
I could just add to this discussion between legacy media and online media that Nolan brought up. I think one of the reasons we don't get much coverage and therefore background knowledge about what's going on with big tech in terms of their algorithms, in terms of blocking out alternative independent sources within the Google searches, the deplatforming, because all this benefits their bottom line. So one of the chapters in our book, it talks about the commercialism and the aspect of how these of how the logic of big tech software is about profitable commercialization and monetization of every kind of speech. And I think, for example, the way I like to connect or have connected war propaganda with the algorithms and the business model is that we've seen the atrocity propaganda come out that labeled Hamas baby killers and rapists, which were stories which were never verified. Those are very visceral, attention-grabbing horrors that really bring up hatreds and things that then justify extreme violence against them. But in a sense, one of the connections is all of the fake news and the conspiracy theories and the outrage that you kind of get into these rabbit holes. They're also very visceral and they're shock value, and they create your attention. And if you push on them and if you spread them around, then that creates advertising revenue for big tech. And so there are connections we can make there about content and things. Anybody else have a comment or?
There's a question on the chat.
Yeah, I see we have a question. I'll just read it to make sure it's part of the video record. The question is, what do we think of independent media, like the political room, regarding its ability to overcome mass media censorship? I'll answer quickly, and then maybe other people on the session want to have a go at this question too. I would say we talk a lot in kind of theory about the relationship between journalism and politics. We talk a lot about the agenda setting function of the press and the ability of the press to establish what people, members of the public especially, think of as the important issues of the day. I think based on my work with Project Censored, and this is directly to the question, Gabriella's question, I think the independent media have a very important agenda-setting function in relationship to the corporate media. What we see at Project Censored on a regular basis when we look at important but underreported stories is that there's often a lag. We've never done a formal study. I would love to someday have the time and the funding to do this study properly. But informally, we know there's often a lag of about 12 to 18 months between when independent journalists and outlets cover an important but controversial story, for example, the US weaponized drone program, and when corporate media, in effect, catch up and cover that story. Sometimes that time lag is much shorter. In either case, whether it's a brief or long time lag, I believe that you can make a strong argument that the coverage by independent news media of topics and issues and perspectives that the corporate media would not cover, in effect, spurs the corporate media to cover those so that they don't lose out in the competition for audience, right? It affects, they see the potential for lack of coverage to affect their bottom line, and corporate outlets are then, in effect, pressured by independent media to cover those stories. So there's an agenda-setting function that I don't think has been discussed very well in the kind of literature about agenda setting that involves distinctions between independent and corporate media. All that is, I think, very optimistic, and it's kind of a cheerleading call for the power of independent media. Of course, there are massive political economic forces stacking the deck in favor of the corporate media, and that's an important reason why we need to do all we can to bulwark and protect the autonomy of our independent press.
Well, I think if we don't have any more questions, I'd like to thank the panelists. We're well over the time that was allotted to us. So thanks so much, everybody, for being here. And thank you again for inviting us. And so we'll sign off.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Robin, for leading this thing.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone.
Yeah.